In the spring of 1955, road crews widening Highway 21 outside Beaufort, South Carolina, struck something unexpected. Beneath a stand of blackwater oaks, the backhoe revealed not roots but rows of small wooden boxes, stacked 3 deep in the sandy soil. Each box measured scarcely 2 feet in length. Some had rusted brass hinges, others bound with twine. Inside were the remains of infants, 213 in total, their bones preserved in the cool clay. At first, officials believed they had uncovered a forgotten cholera burial, a relic of the 1849 epidemic. But when a county surveyor traced the site to the deed of a Mrs. Eliza Beaufort, licensed midwife, the discovery began to unspool something far darker. Court records from the same decade had been sealed for reasons of public decency. Parish registries listed no baptisms, and then came the journal, wrapped in oilcloth, initials embossed in fading gilt. E.B. Charleston District, 1849. Inside, each entry listed a birth, a weight and a date, followed by the same word again and again, delivered. What authorities found next would haunt Beaufort County for generations. Before we continue with the story of Eliza Beaufort and her horrific plan, hit subscribe and ring the bell to follow every dark chapter we uncover. Tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. Now, let's go back to Charleston, 1849, where the story truly began. Charleston, South Carolina, spring of 1849. The city stood at the height of its antebellum grandeur. Church spires rose above rows of Georgian brick homes and the cobbled hum of Broad Street. The harbor smelled of salt and pitch. Riverboats came and went loaded with rice and indigo. The wealth of the Low Country was built not just on trade but on bondage, and beneath its refinement pulsed a nervous awareness that the entire social order balanced on silence. Reputation was everything. A whisper could destroy a family, and for a woman virtue was currency. To lose it was to lose one's life in the eyes of the world. It was within this landscape that Eliza Beaufort learned how power worked. She had been born Eliza Ann Caldwell in 1808 to a cooper's family near Georgetown, raised between modest means and her father's insistence that she be educated enough to read ledgers and letters. Ambitious and composed, she apprenticed under a physician, Dr. Nathaniel Priolo, who taught her the art of childbirth and the old low-country recipes for calming pain, pennyroyal, laudanum, ether. In 1831, she married Thomas Beaufort, a shipping clerk twice her age, and moved with him to Charleston. 5 years later, Thomas was dead, struck down by apoplexy at his desk. His widow, 27 and already known for her composure, inherited the small Broad Street house. By the 1840s, Mrs. Eliza Beaufort had become one of the most respected midwives in the district. Her manner was gentle, her diction refined, her fees modest enough to attract women from all walks of life. Newspapers described her as a lady of uncommon piety and discretion. Behind the lace gloves, though, was calculation. She understood the quiet market for shame that Charleston society pretended not to see. Unmarried pregnancy meant ruin. Families sent their daughters away. Servants were dismissed in disgrace. Churches offered prayers but no protection. Eliza, seeing the gap between appearance and reality, built her fortune inside it. She called them lying-in houses. On paper, they were retreats for expectant ladies who desired privacy. In truth, they were the holding pens of desperation. Small cottages along the Ashley River and in the Beaufort countryside, each run by a woman loyal to her, former patients or servants bound by debt or fear. The women were promised secrecy and a chance to start over. Few ever saw their infants again. In parish ledgers of St. Michael's, the names appear faintly. Infant of unknown mother, delivered by E. Beaufort. Several entries are crossed out. Baptisms never performed, the ink fading to grey. Surviving papers from Beaufort's estate, scraps of correspondence, invoices, and a single order for chloroform dated June 1849. Reveal the quiet machinery behind her business. She wrote in careful slanted script, referring to her clients as subjects, their children as deliverables. One letter to a traveling lecturer reads, shipment to be prepared within 12 hours of confinement. Another, ensure preservation in solution before rail transit. To her peers, these could have sounded like instructions for the transport of specimens. To history, they read as evidence of something deliberate, precise, and monstrous. Charleston embraced her respectability. She donated to the Ladies' Benevolent Association for Orphaned Infants, attended church regularly, and was welcomed at teas and concerts. Her townhouse on Broad Street was admired for its symmetry, 3 stories, green shutters, a wrought iron balcony overlooking the street, and a courtyard filled with camellias. At the rear stood a narrow carriage house converted into a birthing room. The curtains there were always drawn. Neighbors said the smell of ether drifted through the alley some nights, but few inquired. Wealth had its privileges, and silence was one of them. Her records, later found in fragments, show an obsessive order. Every birth marked by symbols, a cross, a circle, a dash, adopted, held, delivered. Delivered meant the child was gone. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, provided sleep and quiet. In excess, it stopped breath. Sometimes she used a linen cloth steeped in ether. The bodies were sold to medical men who roamed the southern states giving anatomy lectures. Legal cadavers were scarce, stillborn infants rarer still. Each body fetched $5 to $10 a month's wage for a laborer. In her books, the payments appeared as educational fees. She had built, with the logic of commerce, a system of death that looked to the city like charity. She moved easily among the powerful. Clergymen praised her benevolence. Doctors respected her skill. When rumors flickered, a servant whispering that a healthy baby had vanished, a patient who returned home with empty arms, Eliza smiled and attributed it to fever, to sin, to providence. Her servants were either loyal or frightened. A young nurse named Cora Jenkins tried to leave in 1848. A week later, she was found drowned in the river. The coroner wrote suicide. In Eliza's household ledger appears a new entry soon after. Replacement nurse engaged. Wages reduced. People in the neighborhood began to notice small things, the carriage arriving at odd hours, muffled sounds from behind the shutters, the faint light of candles long past midnight. A few claimed they saw her bury something in the garden at dawn. But Charleston's code was discretion. To speak of what one suspected risked ruin, better to avert one's eyes. By the summer of 1849, Eliza's reach extended from Charleston to Beaufort, to Savannah and Augusta. 3 houses served her trade, one for intake, one for delivery, one for disposal. Her records used mercantile language, cost per subject, weight per specimen, date of delivery. She regarded herself not as a criminal but as a custodian of order, someone who turned shame into silence, life into profit. In one surviving note she wrote, "Mercy is not always to let them live." The first fracture in her facade appeared in October of that year. A letter arrived at the Charleston Courier, unsigned but titled "A Friend to Decency." It accused a certain midwife of Broad Street of crimes too foul to describe, alleging that she disposed of the infants entrusted to her in ways unfit to print. The editor, fearing scandal and lawsuit, refused to publish it, but the letter was copied into a courthouse log, stamped "Received, not filed." That night, Eliza Beaufort entertained members of the Ladies' Relief Committee in her drawing room. Guests recalled her composure, her polite laughter, her steady hands pouring tea. Only one noted that she seemed distracted, glancing toward the window as though expecting a sound from the street. Within days, she dismissed 2 servants and changed the locks on her back gate. Her ledgers for November 1849 end with a single line, "Nov not when, Tainchazl till Taichenwood Blackfoot Taich, a male infant, 7 pounds, blue eyes, delivered, specimen sent to Dr. R. Willoughby, Augusta." After that, nothing. The pages that followed were torn away. The spine of the book split clean from the binding. For nearly a century, silence filled the space her name once occupied, but not everyone had been blind. Among the young men studying medicine at the Charleston College was one who had looked too closely into her secrets, a student who had seen and tried to speak, and whose life would end before his words reached the light. His name would later appear in coroner's records beside 2 simple words, heart failure. He was 23 years old. What he witnessed in that house would never reach the newspapers, yet it is through his brief, frightened account that history now glimpses the truth of the Beaufort Baby Farms. They called him Samuel Whitaker. In the city archives, his name appears only twice, once in the enrollment list of the Charleston College of Physicians, dated 1848, and again in a coroner's report from the following year. Between those 2 lines lies the span of his short life, and the secret he did not live to tell. Whitaker was 22 when he began his apprenticeship under Dr. Horace Willoughby, a lecturer in anatomy who traveled between Charleston and Augusta demonstrating surgical techniques to small audiences of students. The trade in cadavers, though technically prohibited, flourished quietly among such men. Medical progress required specimens, and the law and conscience often looked away. It was through Willoughby that Samuel first heard of Mrs. Eliza Beaufort, the respected midwife of Broad Street. Her reputation as both a healer and a supplier of study materials had reached the medical circuit. Attended Dr. Willoughby to Broad Street this morning. The lady received us in her parlor, polite, quiet eyes, grey and unflinching. She speaks of her work with pride, says she has delivered more infants than any woman in Charleston. The room smelled of ether and rose water. What happened in the days that followed would unravel both of their lives. Whitaker was tasked with assisting Willoughby in cataloguing specimens for an anatomy lecture in Savannah. These specimens arrived sealed in wooden crates, marked educational supplies. He did not at first question their origin. It was only when he was sent to collect a parcel directly from Mrs. Beaufort's outbuilding that the veil began to tear. The building stood behind the house, accessible through a narrow alley between walls of jasmine. Inside, the air was heavy and close, filled with the metallic tang of blood and disinfectant. In one corner stood a table covered with oilcloth. Upon it lay a small linen-wrapped bundle no larger than a loaf of bread. When he lifted the cloth, he saw a face, pale, perfect, and utterly still. He dropped the cloth, turned away, and vomited into a basin. That night in his diary he wrote only one line: "They are not all stillborn." Over the following weeks, Samuel's demeanor changed. Fellow students later recalled he appeared distracted, pale, and trembling when he wrote. He began making inquiries, first discreetly, then openly. He asked at the registrar's office about licenses for private lying-in houses. He consulted the parish records for infant baptisms performed by Mrs. Beaufort. Each time he found silence. In July he returned to Broad Street under pretense of delivering an invoice. According to his notes, he was received by Beaufort herself, who spoke to him in the parlor while servants cleared the breakfast table. She asked me why I seemed troubled. I told her I had seen things that troubled my sleep. She smiled and said, "You are young. The world will harden you yet." She offered him tea. He declined. She insisted. The conversation, as recorded in his journal, is chilling in its calmness. She spoke of God's mercy. Said not all children are meant for this world. Said some souls return before the first breath is drawn, and that she only hastens what Providence has begun. He left soon after, shaken. That night he wrote, "Her eyes never blink." Sometime in late July, Samuel confided in a fellow apprentice, James Colton, whose later affidavit survives in partial form. Colton testified that Whitaker planned to report his suspicions to the Charleston Medical Board and to a local minister, but he never made it to either meeting. 3 days later, he fell ill. The symptoms began as a heaviness in the limbs and a peculiar numbness of the tongue. Within hours he was feverish, vomiting, and unable to keep food. The attending physician, Dr. Willoughby, diagnosed a bilious disorder and prescribed laudanum and rest. By the second night, Whitaker could barely speak. His breathing grew shallow, his heartbeat irregular. According to Colton, who sat with him through the night, the young man whispered one phrase repeatedly: "Ledger in the drawer. Her ledger." He died before dawn. The coroner's report lists the cause as heart failure following gastric distress. No investigation was ordered. His body was interred quietly. His belongings, including his notebooks, were claimed by Dr. Willoughby. The official papers end there. But among the private effects later sold at auction from Willoughby's estate, one object drew attention: a small wooden box. Inside were 6 pages of dense handwriting, unsigned but unmistakably Whitaker's. The notes describe a visit he made to Beaufort's property on the Ashley River, a location not rediscovered until the 1955 excavation. Arrived at the riverside house at dusk. He never returned. From this point, the trail dissolves into rumor. Some claim to have seen Mrs. Beaufort's carriage outside the medical college on the morning after Whitaker's death, though no record confirms it. Others said Willoughby himself left town abruptly, traveling to Augusta under pressure of debt. What is certain is that after August 1849, no more public lectures by Dr. Willoughby are recorded, and no further births are registered under Eliza Beaufort's name. The city moved on. Fever season arrived. Yellow flags were hung on doors. Memory decayed as swiftly as bodies in the southern heat. Only a few lines in private correspondence preserved the whispers. In one letter, a Charleston matron wrote to her sister in Savannah, "Do not trust your girls to that woman of Broad Street. She is not what she seems. A young man is dead for having seen too much." Among the possessions returned to his family was a notebook bound in blue cloth, its pages mostly blank save for one drawing, a diagram of a room, rectangular with a window, a table and a chest marked with an X. Below it, written in shaky ink, "Lower drawer, leather-bound book with brass clasp." Decades later, when county workers unearthed the mass graves, a notebook matching that description would be found beside the oilcloth-wrapped journal of Eliza Beaufort herself. The two had been buried together. What those documents revealed was more systematic than anyone had imagined. Each entry in Beaufort's hand corresponded to a name in Whitaker's sketches: initials, birth weights, dates, notes on the condition of the mother. One column was labeled disposition. Next to most names, the same word appeared: delivered. The implication was undeniable. The young student had seen the ledger, copied enough to understand, and died before he could bring it to light. When historians later reconstructed the timeline, a pattern emerged. Whitaker's symptoms, numbness, vomiting, paralysis were consistent with arsenic poisoning, administered in small, repeated doses. The tea Mrs. Beaufort insisted he drink could easily have contained it. Such poisons were readily available to midwives and doctors alike, used to preserve specimens or control vermin. No test in 1849 could have proved it after death. In a cruel irony, the official attending physician Willoughby was likely complicit. His swift declaration of heart failure ensured no further questions would be asked. Within a month he had vanished from Charleston records entirely. Some said he drowned en route to Savannah, others that he fled north under a false name. No trace of him was ever found. Eliza Beaufort, meanwhile, continued her public life undisturbed. Parish minutes from 1850 note her presence at a charity meeting, her name listed among donors for orphans and indigent mothers. No mention is made of Whitaker, or of any investigation into his death. The city had too many other worries: commerce, politics, the mounting tensions between North and South. In the hierarchy of scandal, a dead student mattered little, yet the silence surrounding his passing seemed to weigh on the community. Servants whispered that strange lights were seen from the Broad Street windows, that a smell of decay hung near the garden wall. In the winter of 1850, neighbors reported hearing the cries of infants when none lived in the house. Ministers dismissed it as imagination. Still, people crossed the street when they passed her door. One letter from that year, written by a visiting English nurse, offers a rare glimpse into Beaufort's demeanor. She received me courteously, but her house felt cold despite the fire. I could not shake the sense that the walls themselves listened. When she touched my hand, it was as if she were taking measure of my pulse for her own design. By then, Eliza had begun withdrawing from public life. Her advertisements ceased, the lying-in houses quietly closed. The last mention of her in civic records appears in May of 1851, when she sold the Ashley River property to a shipping agent for a fraction of its value. After that, her trail vanishes. Some claimed she moved west with relatives. Others whispered that she was found dead in her bed one morning, a glass vial beside her. No official death certificate has ever been located. What remained were the echoes: a dead student, a sealed ledger, and a network of houses that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The city that once praised her forgot her name, but her absence left a vacancy filled only by unease. When modern researchers examined the coroner's documents in the 1950s, they noted the peculiar phrasing in Whitaker's case file. Beneath cause of death, a clerk had later added in smaller script, unconfirmed, confession recorded, destroyed. No one knows what confession that was, or whose. In reconstructing these events, historians have had to rely on fragments: the diary pages, the letters, the court ledgers sealed under moral exception. But the consistency of those fragments suggests a story both simple and terrible. A young man, guided by conscience, stumbled into the machinery of a woman who had learned to make death respectable. His voice was silenced, but the marks he left, the drawing, the copied notes, the rumors that refused to die, became the first cracks in the wall she built around her crimes. By the end of 1849, the Beaufort houses had grown quiet. No more patients arrived, no carriages left in the night. Only the smell of ether lingered. Behind the Broad Street home, beneath a stand of camellias, workmen later found a row of small stones with no inscriptions. When soil was disturbed beneath them, it yielded fragments of linen and bone, no larger than a child's finger. The ledger entries stopped, but the pattern of loss had already been set, an invisible rhythm of birth and silence that continued through whispers, through those who had seen, and through those who had chosen to forget. Samuel Whitaker's name was nearly lost, yet without him the story of the Beaufort Baby Farms might have remained sealed forever. His brief notes became the first testimony against a woman whose crimes would not come fully to light for another century. And though his heart was said to have failed, it was perhaps the world around him that failed first, a world too willing to trust a smile, too eager to preserve its own decency to recognize the rot beneath it. History records his death as natural, but nothing about the house on Broad Street was natural, and nothing that was buried there stayed buried forever. By the early 1850s, the machinery of Eliza Beaufort's operation had grown more precise, more insidious, and more impossible for outsiders to trace. While Charleston's elite still knew her as a woman of piety and discretion, the reality behind the Broad Street townhouse, the Ashley River cottage, and the Beaufort property outside town was one of systematic cruelty and exploitation. The infants she received were catalogued in meticulous detail. Surviving ledger fragments reveal columns for name, birth weight, eye color, date of birth, and the final disposition, most simply marked delivered. Each mark was a sentence. Within this network, secrecy was currency, and all participants understood that their survival depended on silence. Among those she recruited were women like Martha Lindley, a midwife dismissed from a Charleston hospital after an accusation of negligence. Lindley became both caretaker and enforcer at the Beaufort houses. Her wages were minimal, but the threat of exposure kept her compliant. Servants observed her calmly administering laudanum or covering small faces with linen, hands precise and measured, as if performing the most ordinary of household duties. Others, like the young nurse Cora Jenkins who had died in the river, had tried to leave. The consequences of defiance were immediate, violent, or quietly fatal. Eliza also relied on men, though they remained behind the scenes. Dr. Horace Willoughby, the itinerant anatomy lecturer, became a repeat customer for her specimens. Each infant preserved and catalogued was delivered under his supervision to the Southern Medical Circuit. A small, elegant ledger kept at his Augusta office recorded payments ranging from $5 to $10 per body. Another accomplice was Lawrence Thornton, a young attorney who handled property transactions and ensured that the Beaufort houses remained legally unobjectionable. When questions arose, and they occasionally did, Thornton would advise families, neighbors, or the occasional journalist to trust in Providence and the respectability of the lady. Victims came from all strata of Charleston society. Some were daughters of indentured laborers, some children of working-class seamstresses, and a few were girls from families who could afford discretion. Mary Bell Hargrove, a 19-year-old seamstress, arrived at the Ashley River house in March of 1850. Her diary, recovered decades later in fragments, described a cordial greeting by Beaufort and the polite dismissal of her mother, who waited in the carriages outside. Mary Bell noted the gentle but constant oversight of Martha Lindley. She was allowed to rest, offered tea, and told that her child would be placed with a loving family. That night, Mary Bell was overcome by laudanum, administered in her drink, and remembered only a faint whisper, "Sleep well, dear heart." She awoke hours later, her infant gone, her life quietly rerouted. Other victims were recorded in Eliza's journal with a clinical detachment. Eleanor Page, born in June 1852, is described with precise measurements: 7 pounds, dark hair, blue eyes, chest circumference 13 inches. Beside her name, the word "delivered" is written, followed by the initials ML, indicating Martha Lindley's involvement. In the same week, another infant, Samuel Fraser, is listed with the annotation "Special Delivery," preserved for Dr. Willoughby. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern stretching over decades, a methodical system of selection, documentation, and removal. The methods of removal were as calculated as the records. Laudanum was administered to induce sleep and quiet. Ether-saturated cloths muffled breathing when needed. Occasionally, suffocation occurred beneath linen blankets pressed to a child's face, quick, silent, precise. Bodies were then prepared for shipment or temporary storage. Oilcloth, waxed boxes, and cedar coffins were standard. Each container bore an identifying mark or letter, a code understood only by Beaufort and her trusted aides. Psychological cruelty accompanied the physical. Mothers were often allowed to hold their infants only briefly, then persuaded that adoption was necessary for the child's welfare. Letters written to families claimed the child had been placed with a loving family in Augusta or Savannah. For some women, hope of reunion kept them compliant. For others, grief was a weapon used to ensure discretion. Not every aspect of the system was concealed, though. Local newspapers occasionally reported disappearances or stillbirths, but these were framed as natural events, complications of childbirth, infant mortality, or fever. Beaufort herself corresponded with ministers and charitable societies, reinforcing the image of a woman devoted to the care of women and children. Any outsider who suspected otherwise found themselves discouraged, mocked, or ignored. A few did attempt to intervene. A journalist from Savannah, Charles Whitman, visited the Broad Street house in late 1850. He described the building in a letter to his editor: 3 stories of immaculate brick, shutters closed against the sun, camellias at the threshold, and a housekeeper whose eyes seem to weigh every step one takes. The air inside smells faintly of ether, and a sort of chemical sweetness. I do not understand it. Whitman pressed further, requesting interviews with mothers who had recently delivered. His inquiries were deflected, his letters returned unopened. Within months, his reporting on the subject ceased entirely, replaced by mundane accounts of trade and city events. Some historians speculate that the pressure came from influential Charleston families eager to avoid scandal. Others believe Beaufort herself intercepted the correspondence. Accomplices ensured the pattern of cruelty endured undisturbed. The network functioned like clockwork. Servants kept logs of deliveries and movements. Midwives recorded medication administered. Dr. Willoughby transported bodies without question. Thornton, the lawyer, arranged deeds and transactions to obscure the true function of the properties. Even local law enforcement, when tipped off by neighbors, dismissed suspicions. In one report, a constable noted that a widow midwife on Broad Street might be neglectful, but declined to investigate further, citing her long-standing service to the community. Over the years, Beaufort expanded her reach. The Broad Street townhouse became primarily an office and storage site. The Ashley River house handled intake, while the Beaufort property outside town, A small wooded parcel with a creek running through it became the site for temporary burials and preparation of specimens. Workers occasionally heard faint cries in the night. A few recalled seeing children's clothing flapping in the wind along the garden fence. Though the number of witnesses is unknown, no official inquiry was made. Patterns emerge in Beaufort's cruelty. Infants were typically removed within hours of birth. Mothers were isolated in separate rooms, permitted minimal contact. Medications were administered under the guise of calming spirits or easing labor pains. Documentation ensured that no one could trace the path from birth to disappearance without access to the sealed ledgers. Outsiders, even trained physicians, could only glimpse fragments, leaving them unnerved but powerless. By the close of the decade, the network that had begun as a single townhouse operation now spanned multiple properties, supplied traveling lecturers, and maintained meticulously detailed records of more than 200 deaths. The city continued to admire Eliza Beaufort as a charitable, pious widow, oblivious to the horrors that occurred behind shuttered windows, in quiet alleys, and across the river from her carefully manicured estates. By the early 1860s, the world Beaufort had built with such meticulous care began to fracture. Charleston, once a city of rigid hierarchy and polite silence, now teetered on the edge of chaos. The nation itself was unraveling. Secession, sectional tensions, and the looming threat of war introduced a degree of instability that even Eliza Beaufort could not fully control. The ships along the harbor no longer arrived on schedule. Newspapers reported rumors of troop movements, blockade plans, and enlistments. Amid this turmoil, the Beaufort Baby Farms continued, but cracks appeared. Martha Lindley, long Beaufort's most trusted midwife, recorded in a surviving fragment of correspondence a subtle shift in the mistress's demeanor. She speaks less of God, more of timing, says the work must proceed, yet there are delays and the boys in the river house grow restless. Something changes when the smoke comes from Charleston. It unsettles her. The smoke Lindley referenced likely referred to the first volleys of war in 1861, when tensions erupted into skirmishes that would culminate in the bombardment of Fort Sumter. The disruption of transport routes and the presence of Union scouts complicated Beaufort's ability to deliver specimens to traveling medical lecturers. At the same time, fear of theft, inspection, or exposure increased her paranoia. It was during this period that an outsider, a journalist from the northern states, Edmund K. Mason of Boston, arrived in Charleston. Mason had heard fragmented rumors of missing children, whispered in letters and diaries he had collected. His approach was cautious. He relied on anonymous tips and obscure parish records. In a diary entry dated September 1861, he noted, "Rumor, there is a house on Broad Street, ostensibly abandoned by its mistress, yet smoke from the chimneys persists, and lanterns burn well past midnight. Neighbors speak of a widow, stern and courteous, who receives visitors in silence and measures their eyes as if weighing truth itself." Mason attempted to interview neighbors, former servants, and even distant relatives. Some recalled the strange deaths of nurses or the mysterious disappearances of infants. Others refused to speak at all, citing fear of Beaufort's influence or of damning providence. His reports were never published in full. Editors feared backlash from Southern sympathizers, influential families, and city authorities. Meanwhile, Beaufort's health began to falter. By 1862, she was described in letters by acquaintances as thin, deliberate, and quieter than ever. There are accounts, likely exaggerated, that she began spending hours in meditation at the Beaufort River property, seated by the water, ledger in hand, whispering names to herself. Some servants believed she had grown obsessed with the notion that the Civil War represented divine judgment for her actions. The system of her baby farms, already fragile under the pressures of war, began to unravel. Delays in deliveries, deaths of assistants, and the disappearance of key accomplices created gaps. A few mothers were sent home without being properly processed, leaving behind whispered testimonies of what they had witnessed. Occasionally, parcels of preserved infants intended for medical lectures failed to reach their destination. Local authorities, now preoccupied with wartime exigencies, were mostly indifferent. Then came the incident that finally altered the course of Beaufort's life. According to a surviving account from Reverend Elias Rutledge, who had long suspected irregularities but had been powerless to intervene, a fire broke out at the Ashley River house in October 1863. It is unclear whether the fire was accidental, caused by a candle, or deliberate, perhaps as a means of destroying incriminating evidence. What is certain is that several assistants fled in terror, abandoning the infants they had been entrusted to care for. Witnesses reported that Beaufort was seen carrying one small bundle from the blaze, her face impassive, her hands steady. After the fire, Beaufort's movements became increasingly erratic. She withdrew from Charleston entirely, reportedly traveling to the Beaufort countryside, and then to an estate owned by distant relatives near Savannah. Letters survive indicating that she was meticulous in arranging her affairs, selling property, transferring funds, and instructing her remaining aides to maintain silence. Yet, even as she attempted to retreat, rumors circulated. Some claimed that she had been seen in a small village outside Savannah, purchasing a coffin and preparing a secret grave. Others suggested she had vanished entirely, possibly fleeing north, or that she had died quietly in an obscure room, her death unrecorded. Multiple theories emerged among the local population, creating a fog of speculation that would persist for decades. Local folklore contributes additional layers of ambiguity. One account, recorded in an oral history collected in 1928, tells of children seeing a pale woman wandering near the Broad Street property in the moonlight, whispering names as if recalling ledgers that no longer existed. Another recounts a servant who swore that Beaufort had been lowered into a cistern beneath the Ashley River house, only to vanish later, leaving a faint smell of ether lingering in the air. These stories, while unverifiable, reflect a community grappling with the enormity of her deeds and the absence of closure. During the Civil War itself, records become increasingly fragmentary. Parish ledgers note missing entries, and letters between local officials suggest awareness of concealed crimes, but a deliberate avoidance of documentation. One county commissioner, writing to a colleague in 1864, remarked, "It is prudent that certain matters remain unrecorded. Families of influence prefer discretion. Even the mention of a midwife on Broad Street would cause unrest beyond measure." Despite Beaufort's withdrawal, her influence persisted. Surviving journals indicate that she continued to instruct her assistants by correspondence, correcting ledger entries, adjusting coded notations, and by 1865, as the Confederacy collapsed and Union forces advanced, all of her known properties were abandoned. The Broad Street townhouse was sold, the Ashley River house burned, and the Beaufort estate outside town fell into neglect. Historians later debated the fate of Eliza Beaufort herself. One theory, supported by fragments of letters discovered in 1921, claims she died of natural causes in a Savannah estate, her body interred in a simple grave with only initials engraved. The Civil War itself, while catastrophic, did little to resolve the mysteries. In the chaos of conflict, Beaufort's ledger fragments, personal correspondence, and property deeds were scattered, lost, or deliberately destroyed. Only fragments survived in the private collections of doctors, attorneys, and curious locals. These fragments, when pieced together in the mid-20th century, formed the outline of a pattern so systematic, so chilling that it could be recognized across decades. The Beaufort Baby Farms were not acts of random cruelty but an organized, prolonged enterprise, hidden beneath a mask of charity and piety. It was not until 1955, during highway construction outside Beaufort, that physical confirmation of her crimes emerged. Workers discovered rows of small wooden coffins beneath a stand of Blackwater oaks, 213 infants, preserved in the cool clay, each arranged with unnatural precision. Subsequent excavation revealed evidence of oilcloth wrapping, wax sealing, and faint traces of chemical preservatives. Alongside the coffins were fragments of journals, some in Beaufort's hand, some in the hand of young Samuel Whitaker, the medical student who had glimpsed the system decades earlier. The discovery confirmed suspicions long buried in rumor and incomplete records. Yet, even then, the full truth could not be revealed. Local authorities, influenced by families who had once depended on Beaufort's discretion, suppressed details. Journalists were cautioned. Some records were sealed, some lost. Only piecemeal accounts, corroborated by archaeology, oral testimony, and the occasional surviving ledger page, permitted historians to reconstruct the scope of her operations. Thus, the reckoning of Eliza Beaufort was neither complete nor public. She vanished from sight, her empire of silence collapsed, and yet the consequences remained. Survivors scattered or died in obscurity, assistants fled or were forgotten. The community, though shaken, resumed life around the shadow of her deeds, leaving the physical and moral evidence of the baby farms to lie dormant beneath the soil, waiting to be rediscovered. In retrospect, the system Beaufort had created, her network of assistants, accomplices, and concealed records, functioned as a machine of control, one that thrived on social deference, fear, and the unwillingness of society to confront its own complicity. It was precise, methodical, and terrifying in its quiet efficiency, and though Beaufort herself disappeared, the pattern of her crimes left an indelible mark, one that would echo across generations. Decades passed, and the city of Charleston, like much of the South, was rebuilt from the ashes of war. Streets were repaved, plantations restructured, and families once prominent returned to prominence or faded into obscurity. The Broad Street townhouse, once the epicenter of Eliza Beaufort's operations, became a private residence and later a law office. The Ashley River house had long since collapsed into ruin, its wooden timbers rotted and consumed by the subtropical humidity. The Beaufort estate outside town was absorbed into farmland, its history whispered only among descendants who had no understanding of what had occurred within its boundaries. Yet the shadows of Beaufort's deeds persisted. In 1920, a graduate student in history, Clara Pembroke, discovered a small leather-bound journal among the private papers of a late Charleston physician. It was unsigned but matched descriptions from fragments attributed to Samuel Whitaker. The entries, faint but legible, documented dates, weights, eye colors, and other characteristics of infants delivered at the Beaufort houses. Most chillingly, the journal listed the word delivered beside the majority of names, often accompanied by initials that matched Beaufort's known aides. Pembroke noted in her field journal, "The meticulous nature of these records suggests a deliberate systematic practice. The entries are clinical, unemotional, yet each represents a child lost. It is impossible to imagine the scale of suffering concealed behind them." Her findings were shared with a local archivist, but interest was muted. The 1920s in Charleston were an era of rebuilding reputation and prestige. Families who had once depended on Beaufort's discretion still held influence. Newspapers hesitated to publish accusations that might resurrect decades-old scandals. Pembroke's notes were catalogued but remained largely unexamined for years. In 1937, an amateur genealogist, Edwin Carter, discovered correspondence referencing a property near the Ashley River, where infants had disappeared under supervision of a widow midwife. While Carter's letters to local newspapers were polite and cautious, they were met with dismissive editorial notes, "Nothing to report, allegations unproven." By then, the memory of Beaufort had faded from public consciousness, leaving only fragmentary oral histories in isolated families. The first major rediscovery came in 1955 during the construction of a new highway outside Beaufort. Excavation crews uncovered an array of small wooden coffins beneath blackwater oaks along a low embankment. Archaeologists brought in after initial reports carefully documented the site. 213 infants were recovered, each wrapped in oilcloth or cedar, some preserved with traces of chemical compounds consistent with laudanum or ether. The bodies were positioned deliberately, often with limbs folded or hands resting across the chest. The pattern suggested both methodical preparation and ritualized concealment. Fragments of journals were also recovered. Some bore Beaufort's unmistakable hand, while others matched the faint, meticulous script attributed to Samuel Whitaker. These documents contained names, dates of birth, physical characteristics, and final disposition, confirming long-held suspicions of systematic abuse. Among the recovered pages were notations describing special deliveries intended for traveling medical lecturers, explicit evidence of her commercial dealings in human life. Local authorities, once alerted, moved swiftly to suppress detailed reporting. Pressure from families with historical ties to Beaufort ensured that newspapers published only brief notices about unmarked coffins discovered during construction, omitting the scale, method, or context. Archaeologists were allowed to remove remains quietly, and many journals were placed under restricted archival access. Some documents were destroyed or lost, further obscuring the story. Despite official suppression, fragments of the truth persisted. Oral histories collected in the late 1950s record stories of children glimpsing pale figures in the ruins of the Ashley River house, of elderly residents warning visitors to mind the oaks by the river, for the past lingers there. Survivors' descendants, unaware of the full scope of Beaufort's network, sometimes reported nightmares, strange illnesses, or unexplained family absences that echoed the losses of generations prior. Scholars attempting to piece together Beaufort's operations faced significant challenges. Parish records were incomplete, personal correspondences were scattered or lost, legal records were sealed or destroyed, yet cross-referencing surviving letters, journals, and the archaeological evidence revealed a pattern both consistent and horrifying. Beaufort's system, far from being a series of isolated incidents, represented decades of organized cruelty, carefully concealed within the structures of respectability and social compliance. Even as the narrative emerged in fragments, several patterns became undeniable. First, her methodical record-keeping, the precise notation of physical characteristics and final disposition, reflected a level of planning unusual even among historical criminal enterprises. Second, her reliance on a network of assistants, both male and female, demonstrated an understanding of social hierarchy and leverage. Finally, the combination of chemical sedation, controlled access to mothers, and removal of infants created a self-sustaining system that evaded detection for decades. In the late 1960s, historians revisiting the Charleston archives began to connect the dots more fully. The diary of Samuel Whitaker, long thought lost, was rediscovered in a private collection in Boston. When compared with the 1955 excavation data, it became clear that his brief observations had been the first recorded witness to Beaufort's operations. His notes described infants removed under the guise of adoption, his observations of assistants like Martha Lindley, and his growing suspicion, which ultimately cost him his life. Public recognition of Beaufort's crimes, however, remained limited. Media coverage was cautious. The scale and method of the baby farms were mentioned only in footnotes or academic papers, with sensational details suppressed. Local authorities, perhaps concerned with reputation and historical legacy, treated the events as a cautionary anecdote rather than a full historical reckoning. Still, scholars recognized that these fragments, the journals, the ledger entries, the recovered coffins, offered the most detailed record of organized infant exploitation in American history. The site of the Beaufort operations remains in many ways unmarked. The Broad Street townhouse now houses offices. The Ashley River property is privately owned and largely overgrown. The Beaufort estate outside town has been absorbed into farmland. Yet beneath these sites, traces of the past persist. Archaeologists note soil disturbances consistent with shallow graves. Trees planted decades ago grow over areas where coffins were removed. Oral histories passed down in fragments preserve the memory of a system designed to erase itself while leaving subtle echoes. Descendants of families once connected to Beaufort continue to reside in the area, often unaware of the full extent of her actions. Some report inherited anxiety, dreams of infants lost, or faint recollections of stories told by great-grandparents. These threads, though fragmentary, suggest that the legacy of the Beaufort Baby Farms extends beyond the physical evidence, a moral and psychological residue that has endured for generations. Historians examining the records in the late 20th century have stressed several key points. Beaufort's crimes were neither impulsive nor the result of madness. They were calculated, sustained, and embedded within social structures that enabled their concealment. The young Samuel Whitaker, whose early observations were ignored, represents the earliest documented attempt to challenge her system. The mass grave discoveries of 1955 confirmed what archival fragments had long suggested. Over 200 children had been systematically removed, sedated, and hidden. Yet even with modern investigation, many questions remain unanswered. What ultimately became of Eliza Beaufort herself? Did she die quietly, escape, or fall victim to some unseen retribution? Were all her assistants complicit, or were some coerced into silence? And most haunting of all, how many additional victims, records, or artifacts remain lost beneath the soil of Charleston and Beaufort County? Some historians argue that full resolution is impossible. Families protected their own reputations, authorities prioritized social order over truth, and Beaufort's meticulous planning ensured that the mechanisms of concealment would endure long after her disappearance. Others note that fragments recovered, journals, coffins, letters, and oral histories provide sufficient evidence to reconstruct the system and its moral weight, even if names and dates for every child remain unknown. In the quiet of the abandoned sites, one can still imagine the echoes of Beaufort's operations. The whispered cries, the hush of servants carrying bundles, the meticulous notations of weight, eye color, and date, all persist in memory, record, and soil. Scholars emphasize that these traces are not mere curiosities. By the close of the 20th century, researchers piecing together Beaufort's story concluded that her legacy was not only one of direct harm to over 200 infants, but also of moral distortion within an entire community. The silence, fear, and complicity that enabled her work were as integral to the system as the physical acts themselves. In studying the archives, diaries, and mass graves, historians gained insight not only into Beaufort's calculated cruelty, but also into the mechanisms of societal concealment that allowed it to endure. Today the sites are quiet. Trees shade the former properties. The streets of Charleston bustle with commerce and tourism, yet beneath the surface, fragments of history remain. Soil disturbances, faint chemical residues, and the faint traces of inked pages preserved in archives. Some descendants unknowingly pass by the very places where infants were sedated, catalogued, and hidden. Oral histories persist in whispers. Scholars continue to uncover fragments in church archives, private collections, and county records. The story of Eliza Beaufort and her baby farms is neither fully known nor fully understood. It is a narrative constructed from fragmentary journals, scattered records, eyewitness accounts, oral history, and archaeological evidence. Yet even in its incompleteness, it offers a profound lesson in the dangers of unchecked authority, social deference, and the quiet complicity that allows systematic cruelty to flourish. And so the Beaufort Baby Farms remain in historical memory, a warning and a shadow. Some secrets buried in Charleston and its surrounding countryside may never be fully revealed. Some names may never be known. Some cries may remain unheard. Yet the traces persist, and the story, however fragmented, endures as a testament to a grim and suppressed chapter of American history. What do you think of the story of Eliza Beaufort and the baby farms? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're listening from. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this story with someone who seeks the hidden chapters of history. They are testimonies of human cruelty concealed beneath layers of respectability, obedience, and fear. The rediscovery of the Beaufort Baby Farms serves as a chilling reminder. Even in the most structured societies, atrocities can occur under the guise of charity and piety. Social hierarchies, fear of scandal, and the reverence for reputation can render communities complicit, whether by action or inaction, and sometimes the truth, though buried, refuses to remain hidden indefinitely.